Hello, we're about to start. I'm also launching a poll so everyone can participate. It's just a couple of questions to know more about your background in accessibility and know where you are in your journey. But first, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Erin Mastrantonio is the Accessibility Director and Chief Operating Officer here at Elevation. A long-standing advocate for the cause of equal access to information, Erin's career began in the STEAM fields of electrical engineering and radio astronomy. Her experiences studying physics and math in undergrad and graduate school with an auditory processing disorder led her to seek more visual ways to present abstract scientific concepts, and she developed a deep interest in data visualization as a way to bridge the learning gaps she experienced for herself and other visual learners. After a successful career in Silicon Valley, working for an educational consulting firm, Erin turned her focus towards the nonprofit sector and using the power of the internet to democratize access to not only education, but vital services for those in need in our communities. So please welcome Erin, and please, Erin, take it away.
Thank you, Luis, so much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to talk with you today. I've really been looking forward to this webinar. And first, I just want to start off by acknowledging you for having an interest in this topic and for your time and attention today. I know that what draws you here is a desire to serve others. And that in many ways is a dream audience for a webinar like this, because accessibility is really all about serving others. So in the spirit of serving, I'd like to start off just with a housekeeping task. I'd like to ask you, even though I know who you all are, you guys don't know each other. So if you could just take a moment to go over to the chat and tell us your name, where you're joining us from. And in the same message, I'd like you to share just one thing that I could address today that would make your lives easier in terms of implementing accessibility in your organizations. And we will get to as many as we can at the end during the Q&A. Luis will be monitoring the chat. And if we don't have time to address anybody's questions today, I will definitely make time. I just want you to know that I'm committed to you all getting your questions answered. So I'll be personally reaching out to email you guys. So don't worry if we don't have time to address your question today, but we'll be responding to the most popular questions that come in. While you guys are entering that information, I'd just like to start off with a bit of a personal story. So during the pandemic, I've been living down here in Argentina, working at our Buenos Aires office at Elevation. And I live alone and don't have really any companionship, so that would get lonely at times. And so I signed myself up for an interesting service called Dial-Up. Some of you may have heard of this. It's a service where you enter a username and the languages you speak, and it pairs you with a stranger anywhere in the world who just wants to connect with another human and have a conversation. So one night, this was in June of 2020, this was a Wednesday night at 9 p.m. I remember because it was poetry night. I got a random call from a gentleman in Washington, D.C. named John. And we started off the conversation, we were just talking and relating and sharing our poems and laughing. And inevitably the conversation turned towards, what do you do for a living? And I told him that I work in digital marketing. And he said, oh, really? That's interesting because I'm a web accessibility advocate. I test websites for a living. And I thought, how interesting and serendipitous, because I've been really interested in this topic and our clients have been asking about it. And, we're sort of starting our accessibility initiative around that time. And so I asked him, what does a typical day for you look like? And he described that for me. And at the end, I said, wow, John, this must be really fulfilling work for you. And he said, Erin, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, increasingly, it feels less like I'm a human and more like I'm being replaced by a checklist. And my heart dropped because we had just had such a wonderful, deep human conversation. And, I could feel his humanity, but I could definitely see how that would happen. So that was my introduction to web accessibility. And I'm so grateful that it started off that way because it oriented me from the start towards this idea that what we're doing when we do accessibility is we're serving a human on the other side of a screen that just doesn't want to be forgotten. They just want to be considered. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I know that you came here to learn more about WCAG and the standards and the checklists and all of that. But let's not forget, what we're doing and what this is all about. So with that in mind, let's talk about the agenda. I'm going to start off by giving you a modern definition of disability, because the definition has definitely changed over time. Then we'll jump right into accessibility and the WCAG standards. I'll give you a top level view of that. And then we're going to present the 6 most common errors on the web today and how to solve them with completely free tools. So busting the myth that accessibility is difficult or expensive. And then I'm going to give you some practical tips for how to get started in your organizations with an accessibility initiative. And in the remaining 15 minutes, we will have an open Q&A, and I'll address as many of your questions as possible. All right, so let's kick it off. So the definition of disability. In 1980, the World Health Organization defined disability as a personal health condition that is outside the quote unquote normal range of human ability. So this definition was very closed in on the individual, and it really focused on the impairment that an individual experiences. But as we've seen throughout the course of history, anytime where we start defining what is normal and what is not normal, we tend to get into trouble. So in 2001, the World Health Organization completely scrapped that definition, and they adopted this new definition, which now is referred to as the social model. And this is a more complex definition and a more complete and coherent one that defines disability as context dependent. And so in general, it's a mismatched interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they find themselves. So you can imagine the impact that personal prejudices have, that our physical space presents to us, the barriers that can come about there. And also inside of our devices, there are all kinds of barriers that exist in our devices. So let's explore just a few barriers that people experience in the physical world. So this is a clear mismatch. This is a mismatch for anybody who is rolling something, whether that be a wheelchair, a stroller, or some luggage. And this is a mismatch for someone who is not sighted, in the case where they don't have anyone to read off this menu to them. So something as benign as a restaurant menu that we experience all the time, this can actually be a barrier. Now let's explore some barriers in the digital world. This one is great. So yeah, if you want to read our main content, just go ahead, use your tab key and enjoy our nav menu of 72 items. Or this one, hey, just click this red button to take advantage of this special offer. But if you're colorblind, this screen might look something like this. Or for those who use screen readers and they are presented with a list of links, which is a common feature of screen readers, if the links are not written with descriptive link text, this is what they have to choose from. Or what an image looks like to a blind person that doesn't have alt text. Or even more eye roll inducing, what it looks like when the alt text looks like this. So those are just a few examples of barriers that people can experience in the digital world. So now I'd like to jump into accessibility and the standards themselves. So we'll give you some top level definitions. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, what are they? Well, basically, it's a set of success criteria that exist in a hierarchy. So they're grouped under 13 guidelines and 4 core principles at the top that we refer to as the core POUR. So POUR, for easy to remember. And these are principles that are testable and technology agnostic, and they help make web content accessible to people with vision, hearing, mobility, and cognitive impairments. The number of success criteria can vary depending on the adopted standard and conformance level. But just to give you an overview of that, so we started off with WCAG 1.0 in May of 1999. So if some of you may remember, 1990 was when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. So just under a decade later, we got the first version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And about every 10 years after that, we got an update, and bringing it up to the present day, we're now expecting any day now for WCAG 2.2 to be released. So depending on which one of these versions of WCAG that your organization adopts, you'll have a different number of success criteria. But if you want to go with the legislative trends today, what I really recommend, if you haven't been advised by your legal team to start somewhere else, is to start with WCAG 2.0 AA. Why? Because that is the level that's being pushed and lobbied for in the Department of Justice in the United States. Even though it hasn't been passed into law yet, and there isn't a mandate for anyone other than a federal organization who receives federal funding, it's still, going with the trend to adopt this standard. For example, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act just passed up in Canada on January 1st of this year. And around the world, globally, that people seem to be agreeing that 2.0 AA is the best standard. Okay, so just jumping into these core principles that we refer to as POUR, let's start off with the P. So P stands for perceivable, and this really underlies all of the other principles. If you can't perceive something, then you can't do anything with it. So the question here to ask is, can I perceive all of your content using at least one sense? In other words, if I can't see it, can I at least hear it? And if I can't hear it, can I at least see it? And if I cannot hear it nor see it, can I feel it? So some of you may be familiar with a dynamic braille display that takes content that is visible and translate it into braille in real time on a device that looks something like a keyboard, but definitely different. That's one assistive device. We'll talk about some others today. There's some work being done, interestingly, in the areas of using our taste and smell sensations. But for right now, when we talk about perceiving, we're talking about the big three senses of seeing, hearing, and touching. Okay, moving on to the O. This stands for operable. And what it refers to is, can I interact with all of your content using a keyboard and mouse, or some other assistive technology that mimics a keyboard and mouse, since that is the main way that we interact with web technologies today. So in their absence, we have things like joysticks. We can also speak our commands directly into the computer using voice-activated technology. There are also devices that we can attach to our heads that have long wands that can depress keys, and sticks that we can place in our mouths that we can also use, like if you have experienced limb loss and you're not able to manipulate the keys, we have these kinds of sticks we can place in our mouths. Also switch devices. This is a whole class of assistive technologies that's really cool. I invite you all to go to YouTube and check out all the different manifestations of switch devices that exist today. So you can imagine anything that has an on and off state, like a pedal, that can mimic the left and right click of a mouse. And people have gotten really creative with this. So go and check out switch devices when you get a minute. Moving on to U. This stands for understandable. And perhaps the best way that I can explain understandable is, what if I had presented this slide to you in this way? Okay, so kind of jarring, right? So the title is not where you expect. Instead of that tall, cool glass of water, now we have this adorable little animal. And as adorable as it is, why is it not the glass of water? And why is the subtitle up at the top in a different font and color? So when we say understandable in the world of web accessibility, what we mean is it has a lot to do with predictability, in addition to just, being simple and clear. So getting back to the question, is your content clear, consistent, and predictable? So How does this break down? Well, first of all, it deals with using simple language. So English is actually a very idiomatic language. If you don't believe me, you know, if you've ever thought something like, hey, let's not beat around the bush with this presentation, let's make a long story short, because I'm trying to wrap my head around this sooner rather than later, and I'm a little under the weather today, so cut me some slack, okay? How do you think Google Translate would have dealt with what I just said? Not very well. So we always want to use clear and simple language when we can and avoid jargon and acronyms wherever possible. Next, it's important to keep our navigational menus consistent across pages. So it should look the same on your homepage as it does on your interior pages. It shouldn't change depending on where you are. If you think about a non-sighted user moving through their environment, like their house, they know where everything is located. They've learned that over time. They do the same thing with a website. They get to know where things are located. And so it's kind of jarring when they don't find things in predictable places. Same thing with icon usage. So if you use a particular icon to mean a certain thing in one place on your website, you should remain self-consistent throughout the rest of your website. And finally, using consistent labels for identical interactions. So if you have a form that spans multiple pages, this would look like, if you use next on the first page to go to the next page, don't use continue or advance, because that will be confusing. So we're talking really, really simple things that can make a website far, far more accessible. Okay. Last but not least, the R refers to robust. And this just means your content works equally well across all operating systems, browsers, and devices. Some of you may remember the browser wars of the early 90s, where everyone was trying to carve out their own little section of the web and build an audience. And so they were building apps that only worked on their platforms. But that doesn't really serve people that are using assistive technologies that only work on certain platforms. And so really, when we build websites, they should work equally well across, whether you're using Safari or Chrome or Firefox, and if you're accessing it through an Apple machine or Windows or Android. So that is what robust refers to. Okay, so we promised that we were going to talk about the most common errors that come up on the web today, but I'd like to pause. Luis, do you want to go ahead and read off the results of our poll from earlier on?
With everyone. 88% of you said that being more inclusive of people with disabilities was the reason you were interested in web accessibility. Around 3% said the anticipation of legislative and regulatory evolution, and a similar percentage was concerned about protecting their brand image and litigation trends. Regarding what stage you're currently in, 67% of you are just getting started. 5% of you are working on buy-in from the leadership team, and 14% have already achieved executive buy-in and are still training the team. And 8% of you are creating documents or training documentation. Thank you for participating in the poll, and back to you, Erin.
Okay, so those numbers are really wonderful to hear, because it's kind of what I expected in terms of prioritizing, being more inclusive as a main driver. I just want to benchmark our results. This is a poll that was presented in the 2020 State of Digital Accessibility report from Level Access, which I encourage you all to check out. They also found that a majority of people, their primary driver for accessibility is to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. Yes, we all have fears at times with the legislative and regulatory environment, but it's, as I said in the beginning, keeping in mind who we're doing this for and what it's all about. It sounds like this group, as I expected, has their priorities straight. And as far as just getting started, a lot of times the accessibility initiative in an organization is a grassroots effort. It doesn't always come from a top-down mandate. That can take some time to achieve. And so I'm going to touch on some ways that we can help speed up that process a little later in the talk. But let's keep going, and I'll present now the 6 most common errors that we see on the web today. So some of you may not be aware, there's an organization called WebAIM, and every year they do a monster accessibility analysis of the top 1 million homepages. And this happens in February of each year. And they report back their results of the most common errors. And this year, these were the top 6. So low contrast text, missing alt text for images, missing form input labels, empty links, missing document language, and empty buttons. So these are really, really simple errors, simple to fix, that is. And I'm going to go through them in turn in priority order so that we can see how easy they are to fix. And if we all went back to our organizations and just fixed these 6 things, the web would be a much more inclusive place. So let's just focus on these for a few minutes, starting with low contrast text. So on the right, you can see the barrier that low contrast text presents. This is text that cannot be distinguished from its background. And again, this was on 86.4% of the top 1 million most visited homepages. And just for your reference, I'm providing here which success criteria in WCAG that this violates. This is in the perceivable group, as you might expect. And the remedy is real simple. So we just need to maintain a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 for regular text, which is 12 point, or 3 to 1 for large text, which is 14 point bold or 18 point. So why is it different for small text versus large text? Well, you see that statement on the bottom in gray. Can you see me? Okay. This "how about now" is in the exact same color, but it's much more perceivable. Still not great, but you can see why there would be a difference for small and large text. And the exceptions to this rule is if your text exists in your logo, if the text is purely decorative, it has no meaning and the user never really interacts with it, then it's not subject to this criteria. And the free tool that you can use to test this out is the Color Contrast Analyzer by the Pacello Group. This is a great tool that you can download. It's a desktop app and it has little color pickers. You can go in and hover over your text and then hover over your background, and it will tell you if you have passed or not this criteria. So it can detect really to a really fine degree what the exact contrast ratio is. Or there's an app called Stark, which is great, and they have a free plan, and they have various colorblind simulators. It's an app all about color and how to make color palettes more accessible. So I encourage you to check that out as well. All right, next, missing alt text. So this is, if you guys remember that blank white slide I had, these are images that lack a text description in code. And so we have issues with this on almost 61% of web pages. And again, we're talking about the perceivable group, success criteria 1.1.1. It's the very first in the list, actually, if that gives you any indication how important this is. And the remedy here is just to fill in the alt attribute for your images. If you're not sure what the alt attribute refers to, ask your developer and they will know what I'm talking about, or any other non-text content, not just images, but also icons, input controls. Anytime an image has an actual function, so sometimes buttons, are served as images. We just need to make sure that we're providing alt text for all of those as well. Exceptions are images that are purely decorative. So for a sighted user, it's really easy to detect immediately, okay, this image doesn't really have meaning or content, like maybe a textured background or, an image, like maybe a divider line, something like that. It might be an image, but it doesn't really serve any purpose. So I give you full permission to skip over that. Actually, I request that you don't write alt text for that, because if you can imagine a screen reader user, they can't just easily skip over like we can. They're stuck having their screen reader read off all of that meaningless alt text to them. So let's not waste their time. And the free tool you can use to check this is a great browser extension that's actually recommended by W3C, the governing body that wrote the WCAG standards. This is called Web Developer, and it's by Chris Pedrick. It meets our robust criteria for working on Chrome, Firefox, and Opera and all the major operating systems. And what it does is it will put a red box around any image that is missing alt text. So that's a way that you can go through and identify real fast if you have any alt text issues. And here's just an example I wanted to show you for the image that you see on your screens. At the top, we have a descriptive alt here that says a handful of cherry tomatoes. Okay, that describes the image, but what's really important about alt text is that it conveys the meaning and says something about the purpose of that image. So the best person to write alt text is actually the person who took the picture or decided to place it there, because they know the answer to the million-dollar question, which is, why am I including this image? So if we were showing off the harvest for a new organic school garden, we might put student holds cherry tomatoes picked from new organic school garden. That would be much better and more meaningful. So keep that in mind when you're writing your alt text. Next, missing form labels. So this is basically anytime a form input is missing an HTML label tag or an ARIA label. This happened on over 50% of web pages, and the fix here is, again, super simple. So you see over on the right on the top, this is a properly labeled form. Not only do we have field labels, we also have the required indicator, not just with an asterisk, but as a word that can be read off by a screen reader. And for any kind of input that requires a special format, like a phone number, we have here an example of what that should look like. And so that's another big part of form accessibility. So I encourage you to adopt that practice of always indicating the format that you expect information to come in. And on the bottom, you'll see a form that isn't accessible, where in order to save space, the developer has put the labels as placeholders inside the fields themselves. In many cases, this cannot be read out by a screen reader. And so it's really just better to put the labels to the left of the field so that it is easy to read. And this relates to the understandable group. The remedy here, I don't expect you guys to understand HTML, but just tell your developer, please always include field labels or ARIA labels. And there are no exceptions to this. If the design or development team gives you a really hard time about this, you can say, hey, you can always hide this label in the code, in the HTML code, using CSS. So they can create a CSS class that essentially puts the label in the code behind the website, but it can still be read off, so it's discoverable. So there's really no excuse for this one. And the free tool that I'm recommending for this is the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool, or WAVE. This is by WebAIM, that same group that did the Millions report. And it's a wonderful overlay that will show you exactly where the errors are on your page and exactly how to fix them in a visual way. So I highly recommend that tool. All right, moving on, empty links. So this refers to any link that doesn't have text associated with it. This is a part of 51.3% of the survey experience these types of issues. And you can sort of see why from the examples on the right. So a lot of times this happens when we're referring to symbols that have a universal shared understanding, like the magnifier symbol in the upper right. We know that that means search, but that symbol has a function. So if it's clickable and has a function, it should have a label. So instead of just having the empty text box and the icon, you could actually put search, and then everyone would know what you're doing with that text box. Same with social media icons that exist in a lot of people's footers. If you don't actually spell out Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and it's just an image, that's difficult for a non-sighted user. And then a lot of websites have images that serve as links. And so that's not a problem as long as you provide alt text. So the remedy here is always include text between your A tags. So A tags are for links. And if you're using an image, just provide alt text for that image. Real simple. Again, the WAVE tool will point out any instances where you're having issues with this. Okay, missing document language. So as you probably guessed, Web pages that don't have their language set in the HTML present problems for screen readers, and also PDFs that don't have their settings set up so that there's a lang entry. This is in about a third of websites. And this drives me crazy because it literally takes like less than 1 minute to fix. You just have to go in and add that one attribute to your HTML tag. And this is important because it will do things like allow the screen reader to load up the correct pronunciation. It will load the correct characters to the page. It even has implications around punctuation. For example, hyphens are handled very, very differently in one language versus another. So it's a small fix that has a big, big impact. If you're curious about what language code you need, I've included some common ones over here at the top. This is for English, it's just EN. Spanish is ES, German, DE, French, FR, and Chinese, ZH. If you need something other than that, you can go to the ISO 639-1 language code list, which I've linked here, and just find the language of your target audience. And for PDFs, you can find the settings for accessibility in file properties. No exceptions to this, okay? It really is a simple fix. And again, you can use Wave to point out if you're having issues with this, and you don't need Acrobat Pro to tag a PDF for accessibility or set it up for accessibility. You just need the standard free tool. Okay, and then our last one, empty buttons. So similar to empty links, this would be anytime a button has no text associated with it. This is again on just under a third of websites experience this issue. And the remedy is to always make sure that we have text between our button tags, or if you're using the input tag for any developers who are here, that we have a value attribute set. What I'm hoping happens after this talk, by the way, because I'm going to share these slides, is that you go ahead and share this with your IT team or whoever made your website. And so if any of this isn't clear to you, it should be clear to your developer. All right. And the exceptions, so a lot of times people will use images inside of button tags. And so if you're doing that, that's a deprecated way of doing it. It's sort of old school. I don't recommend it, but it still happens a lot on the web that we use images as buttons. And so if you've written alt text for that image you're using as a button, then a screen reader can still read that out. So that's still okay, but that's not going to be okay at some point down the line. So I recommend we don't do that. And Wave, again, is the tool of choice here. So that will highlight all of your empty buttons. Okay, so we've gotten to the end of this section. I want to turn now towards some practical tips for getting started in your organization. And just right up front, I want to address a fear that some of you are probably having in getting started with an accessibility initiative. And how do I know that you have this fear? Because I had this fear. When it comes to talking to people with disabilities, we want to make sure that we're using the advisable language and that we're not offending anybody. And that's a really, really simple matter of just using something called people first language. So I'm going to give you some general rules, which should hopefully make it easier if you hire someone onto your team with a disability, or you engage someone to test your website and you're unsure how to address them. Here are some simple do's and don'ts. Okay, so a person who is blind, this is a great thing to say because it puts the person first. And I know this goes against the standard English ordering of things. In English, we normally put the adjective before the noun, but it's really important that we don't characterize impairment as a primary personality trait. So if we say a blind person, yes, it's shorter to say, perhaps more succinct, but we wouldn't, for example, emphasize a character trait that somebody else has that society perceives as negative. So we don't say things like, here comes bad speller Bob. We don't say things like that. So let's not say a blind person, let's put the person first. Similarly, if we're talking about an assistive device, we would say a person who uses. It's a very neutral term. What we shouldn't say is a wheelchair bound person, because that implies that they're experiencing some kind of victimization. And I can guarantee you that disabled, people who experience disabilities, they don't feel like victims. So also a person with a hearing impairment, impairment is a totally fine word to use, as is the word disability. But we would say with rather than suffering from or afflicted with. Again, that implies victimhood. So let's just stick with. And then if you're referring to people in the plural, we would say people who are mobility impaired instead of the mobility impaired. That indefinite article, it seems like a small thing, but it sort of groups everyone together and removes a measure of individuality, and that can feel offensive. Just other terms, in terms of behavior, when you're talking to someone with a disability, make eye contact with that person. If it's a person who has an interpreter, look at them and not their interpreter. If they're in a wheelchair, for example, don't look at their assistive device, look at them. So it's what you would expect in any normal conversation, just make eye contact with the person. And that's particularly important if the person is hearing impaired, by the way, because they can much more easily read your lips if you're looking directly at them. And then finally, before you assume that somebody needs help, just ask them if you're not sure. A lot of times people with disabilities have become experts at navigating their environment, and you may think you're helping, but it may actually be harming. So if you're not sure, just ask. And really simple way to ask is there anything you'd like some help with? And so just don't assume, okay? So here are some ideas. I wanna just kind of leave with some ideas for how to build capacity, because as we saw in the poll, a lot of you are just getting started. And as I said, disability advocacy or web accessibility advocacy is normally starting off as a grassroots effort. So here are just a few fun ideas. I'm not going to read off all of these, but I'll just highlight a few that I particularly like. So you could always celebrate Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which happens every third Thursday in May. You could volunteer to help draft an accessibility statement. A lot of the best websites out there who really care about accessibility have an easy to find accessibility statement on their website, just showing their commitment. So even if your website isn't perfect, what really matters is you're showing a commitment. Some other ideas. So starting to use that person first language at work. If you use Slack, you could start an accessibility Slack channel. You know, or my favorite, perhaps on this list, volunteer to edit or add captions to your audio and video content. So in the accessibility community, captions are often referred to as craptions, if that's any indication of how bad they can be. So that would be a major, major contribution if you did just that. And so I just want to leave with a few calls to action that you can do immediately when you get off the call today. First, I would love for you to go and keyboard test your website. What does that mean? Try to navigate your organization's website using only the tab key and see what happens. Ask yourself a couple of questions while you're doing that. Can I access everything that I can normally access? And can I activate everything that I can normally activate? And once you get done with that, navigate some exemplar nonprofit websites. So, you know, normally we hear about websites like big corporate websites that are doing accessibility well. Well, there are some nonprofits that are doing a great job as well. We don't hear about them as often, but I wanted to point out a few today. Human Rights Watch, they're doing an excellent job. The American Heart Association and Donors Choose, all of these websites have easy to find accessibility statements right on their website. If there's a barrier that someone experiences on that website, they provide a communication channel that you can call or email or do live chat, even better. And once you're done with that, go find out some more stories. Look up some of these inspiring advocates. When I was learning more about this topic in the beginning, I ended up coming across these names that you see here, and they were hugely inspiring to me, opened my eyes and changed my perspective on what web accessibility is. So I encourage you to go look up these and any others you can find. And then finally, just start a conversation. You know, we're starting now to get back to face-to-face interactions. Invite someone to coffee, share with them what you learned today, or any takeaways that you think would be helpful for your organization. It really does start with just conversations. And Before we jump right into the Q&A, I just wanted to close out this webinar by stating the main idea here, which is that accessibility really is for everyone. It's for the 15% of people in this room, for example, that statistically are experiencing some kind of disability, whether it's visible or invisible. It's for the 1.3 billion people that experience disabilities of some form around the world. It's for their immediate friends and family members who are champions for their loved ones and will always support products and services that are accessible versus those that are not. And then for all of the rest of us who are temporarily non-disabled, and I say that not to be fatalist about it, but it's true that all of us at one point or another are going to experience some form of disability, whether that is situational, temporary, or the results of just aging. So we all really are invested in creating a web that we can all use someday. So thank you. I'm going to head over to the chat, and Luis is going to call off some questions during these last 15 minutes. We'll get to as many as we can.
Yes, thank you, Erin. We had a few interesting questions as well as an interesting candid discussion in the chat. But first, let's start with the questions. Patrick asks, is there any accessibility tool or plugin or two for WordPress that you could recommend?
Accessibility tools for WordPress in particular. So all of the tools that I mentioned today, those free tools, they can be used on WordPress websites. You know, Elevation builds WordPress websites, and I don't actually know of any tool that is made for WordPress in particular, and that would sort of violate our robust criteria. It shouldn't just work, you know, for one platform. There may be plugins out there. If there are, I'm not aware of them. I know that these are the tools, the ones I mentioned earlier, they are the ones that are most commonly recommended by the W3C, and they will work for WordPress websites, Drupal websites, Joomla, Squarespace, you name it.
Okay. Another question by Erica Freeman is, we have multiple websites. How can we implement what we learned for non-elevation websites?
Sorry, repeat the question. So
sorry. Erica Freeman said, we have multiple websites.
Right.
How can we implement what we learned for non-elevation websites? I think they're a client of us.
Oh, okay, for non-elevation websites. So, you know, if these are websites that you don't have direct access to the back end, you know, one thing you can do is write to their info at and say, hey, like, I've noticed that you don't have a skip to main content link. You know, you don't actually need to experience the barrier as a personal barrier to raise awareness on somebody else's website. So if it's not a website that you own, I would say reach out to them and ask them, hey, are you aware that you could be doing this? And that will start a conversation in that organization where maybe they would want to assign an accessibility director internally or someone to handle, you know, inbound requests of that nature. I hope that answered the question.
I think that the tools Erin shared are very platform agnostic. So doesn't really matter if your site is built with WordPress or with us or with any other company. We're sharing tools that are universally useful. Another question by Alexander Hamilton is, our organization is working with blind and deaf and helping them with web barriers, including navigating safe versus spoof phishing websites, since screen readers don't pick up on that. Having all text can make your website more trustworthy to them. I think that's more of like a very cool project that she's working on that I listed here just so that everyone would be aware of it.
Great.
Didi Robillard asked, can you address what WCAGs apply to and who? Like, for example, what industry or in what regions or stuff like that? He's talking about like the WCAG standards.
The WCAG standards. So these are actually global standards. So the team that put together WCAG is a global team of accessibility advocates and researchers and, you know, university professors and most importantly, people with disabilities. So what I've seen is that the United States is actually lagging behind the rest of the world, but these standards apply to everyone. The whole point of defining these standards is that it would be a universal standard, and it's tied to the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. It partially grew out of global initiatives in order to make environments more accessible, with one environment being, a website. Increasingly, a website is being defined as equivalent to any other physical space that needs to remain accessible. So which country does it apply to? Really all of them.
Yeah, and I think also the question is trying to get at like maybe regulations or things like that. I think in the US, you mentioned that regulations are not yet at a federal level, except for federal agencies.
Right, right. So the truth of this is, and I'm not a lawyer, consult with your legal team, but in general, unless you're providing a service that is mandated by law, these standards are not mandated. It's not something that you have to do. We do these things because it's important, because we care about inclusion. But as I said, most of us here, we don't have to do any of this stuff. We do it because we care. There is a trend toward, there are some lawsuits that have been brought up, and people that have been advocating for adopting 2.0 level AA. When we finally do go ahead and pass legislation in the United States, but that legislation has been brought forth and killed off several times. It's a matter of time before something passes, and so I don't want to be like fear mongering, but it is a matter of time before more than just federal agencies that provide, basic vital services are going to be subject to this. Right now, the question is whether a website counts as a physical space, and things seem to be moving in that direction.
Thank you. Another question by Whitney Larson. For the format of the number, she's talking about forms in websites.
Yes.
Should this not be outside of the box as well, so the reader can read it as well? So like the format, or like, for example, date format, I'm guessing she's asking about, or things like that.
Yeah, that would be most helpful. You do see it as placeholder a lot, and there is a way to code placeholder text so that it can be read by screen readers. It's just, if you don't apply ARIA labels, that spell out the function and the role of that text, then sometimes it will be skipped over. But if you're doing it correctly, you don't have to put the format outside of the field. But if you're unsure, go ahead and put it outside the field, because then it definitely will be discoverable by a screen reader.
Allison asks, what if we're using plug and play forms like Squarespace? We don't actually have a developer in-house.
So yeah, look up, different platforms have different amounts of, different levels of accessibility. Squarespace actually ranks very high in terms of just built-in accessibility. So the way that they construct their forms, I know that is a closed source platform, and you don't really have control over that. That is one of the disadvantages of a closed source platform. But in this case, for Squarespace in particular, they do very well. And with form accessibility, I think as well, they do very well. If you go to the WebAIM report, they actually have the number of errors broken down by platform, and you'll see that Squarespace is like #1 best for accessibility. So you happen to get lucky and have a good platform there.
You don't have much to worry about then.
Right.
Rochelle asks, if we're purchasing the advanced accessibility plugin, again, I think a client, do we still need to go to these sites to check, or is that provided within the plugin?
Yeah, so that's a great question, talking about these plugins that sort of lay on top of a website and remediate errors on the fly. So those kinds of plugins are great because they provide ready access to do things like increase text size. They can increase contrast. They can switch the font over to a dyslexic safe font. They can do all sorts of cool things. But at the end of the day, these kinds of plugins are a bolt-on, what we call a bolt-on solution. So we really shouldn't be depending on those. We need to be building accessibility into our design and our UX phases. So there's a term called shifting left, which is kind of a buzzword in the accessibility community. And that refers to not addressing accessibility at the end in the development and QA phases. We really need to start off sooner. And those plugins tend to get interpreted in the accessibility community as an organization's effort to just bolt something on rather than build accessibility in. So I'm not going to say that they're not useful. They're very useful, and we use them at Elevation. But really, they're only a complement to a design that has inclusivity built into it.
Okay, thank you. Christopher also recently asked if you can help him help him understand or characterize the differences between the WCAG 2 standard and the newer standard that was released very recently. I think it's 2.1.
Yes, yes, I can. So, so let me go back to that slide, or maybe that might take a long time. Okay, maybe I won't be able to get there. But if so, basically the difference between the standards. So we had 2.0, the difference between 2.0 and 2.1, for instance. So 2.0 has 61 items in the, so if you count up all of them on A and AA conformance level, and they are backwards compatible, by the way. If you adhere to 2.1, then you're adhering to everything in 2.0. So they sort of build on each other. But 2.0 has 65 criteria. As you saw in the timeline, you may not remember, but that came out in 2008. So the difference in devices between 2008 and 2018, when 2.1 came out, is that the mobile world exploded. And so, you know, we added 17 new success criteria between 2.0 and 2.1. And all of the new success criteria were basically addressing the needs of mobile technologies in particular, making sure that we had, for example, like buttons that were large enough so that people, even with hand tremors, could still, you know, access them. So lots and lots of needs around mobile devices, as well as cognitive and learning disabilities. That was a really big thing that got improved upon between 2.0 and 2.1. The difference between 2.1 and 2.2, they're actually adding 8 new success criteria. There's going to be 4 in the operable category and 4 in the understandable category. And it mostly has to do with upgrading not only the output, but the interfaces that are used to build web content themselves. Because let's remember, like, part of what we want to do in any accessibility initiative is we want to make sure that the people who are building, that we're including people with disabilities in the team that builds apps, because, you know, ability bias is always going to have us producing apps that are for people with our abilities. So that's why it's important to make sure that we're always making our interfaces for building web content accessible as well. So you know, the new standards address those needs. If you want to check it out, there's a working draft on the W3C website. You can actually go and preview what those 8 new criteria refer to. I hope that answered the question.
If your social icon is an image that views set alt text for, would that be sufficient for labeling the link? She's talking about like the icons on the footer, stuff like that.
Yes, that was, yep, that was one of the exceptions. So you don't have to spell it out in a word as long as you have alt text there.
Perfect. And now I want to let you know that at the very end, there was a very candid discussion and like feedback regarding like person first language. And I didn't want to like let that out because I think it's healthy for all of us to learn other perspectives. Yes. So Stacy said, not everyone prefers people first language. Many people prefer identity first language. So like, for example, disabled person. And she commented that in her experience, blind people do actually prefer being called blind. And also people that are deaf seem to prefer deaf rather than hearing impaired. And there were a few comments along those lines. Emily also commented that this also varies by like country. So the English speaking world is not a single place. So in Australia or in the UK or Canada, they have different ideas of how we should communicate. So this was a very interesting conversation.
Sure.
And I just want to
Yeah,
know what your thoughts are.
my thoughts are, yeah, I mean, so the conversations that I have been a part of and the guidelines that I have been exposed to mostly emphasize people first. But if you have some other resource or some other, you've had access to conversations maybe that I haven't. So I'm really curious to have you send me more resources about that. So you can reach me at erin@elevationweb.org. I invite you to send me more information about this because now I'm curious.
Okay, thank you, Erin. And I think there are no more questions.
Okay.
And I want to thank everyone for participating and joining us in this webinar. I think it was very educational, both for you and for us that we're learning as well. And I wish you all the best. And hopefully, remember, we'll be sending all the recording, the slides, and the transcript to every single registrant. And also, please feel free to share this with anyone you want, because like the more people can see it and the more people benefit from it, the better. Any last words,
Thank you,
Erin?
everyone. Yeah, no, just thank you all again. I really honor you. I really honor you for taking the time to have this discussion today. It's really a privilege. And so, I can't wait to see what you all do with your organization's websites, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
All right.